guys, welcome back to another PEL video. I thought today it would be interesting to talk about the current coronavirus pandemic and the kind of collective trauma that we're all experiencing at this moment and the long-lasting effects it could have on our psyche and our mentality and the way we view the world. Firstly, I want to define what trauma is exactly. So usually trauma can refer to a traumatic event that somebody has gone through. Usually this manifests itself in sexual abuse victims, people who have experienced some sort of child abuse or manipulation, and those who have gone through a car accident, or maybe they've been in a country that has experienced war. But trauma can also come from more mundane events. It's up to the individual and how they like to perceive it or how their brain perceives it. And oftentimes this will result in post-traumatic stress disorder. And what that means is that they carry this trauma with them long past when the traumatic event occurred. A key identifier for PTSD victims is that they'll view the world as a dangerous place. And there's already been some research done on people who are going through the COVID pandemic, but they haven't really started focusing on the general public yet. It's mostly just for healthcare workers. And this is because it's a lot easier to look into healthcare workers and what's going on there than the general public, just because it's easier to observe what's happening within hospitals or outside of it and to interview them. But as far as the general public goes, we're all still experiencing this trauma. And I think there won't be any studies done on the kind of trauma that's going on all around the world until the pandemic is over, hopefully sometime soon, or at least until it gets drastically better, that it's no longer such a big impact on our daily lives. I think that's when more research about the everyday person will come about. As of right now, healthcare workers are already starting to show signs of trauma and PTSD, and some of the ones that have been observed are that they are experiencing depression, panic, paranoia, and suicidality. And for people in China who work in healthcare, it's 70% of them have reported distress. And in Italy, 50% have reported distress. And these are two of the countries that have been hit kind of the hardest by the pandemic, which, I live in Italy now, probably not the smartest move considering the COVID situation. But yeah, so it is shown that healthcare workers are experiencing these kinds of effects of trauma, and we can only probably see it get worse or progress further from here. The symptoms that the healthcare workers are exhibiting pretty strongly right now would be hyperarousal, sleep disturbances, irritability, nightmares, burnout, and depression. And while we are focusing on seeing how healthcare workers are managing all this, like I said before, since the pandemic is still ongoing, we can't classify this as PTSD yet. We can just classify this as trauma. So we'll have to wait until after the pandemic is over to see if people are exhibiting PTSD symptoms and signs of PTSD, because as of right now, how can it be a post-traumatic stress disorder if we're not post-trauma yet? We're still ongoing trauma. Besides just the healthcare workers, I think it's also important for parents and people who have young children in their lives to try to pay attention to what's going on with them as well, because children, I think, perceive trauma a lot more easily than adults do, because adults have a lot of life experience and they've learned how to handle things and move past them, hopefully, but children don't really have this advantage. So for children, anything that makes the world feel kind of unsafe and uneasy for them can be perceived as trauma. If their parents are having money problems, marital problems, if something's happening at school or with their grandparents, even if for an adult it wouldn't seem something that's a super big deal, for a child they'll perceive it as trauma. And I think right now for children, having to watch the news, hear their parents talking about things, hearing on the radio about all the COVID pandemic stuff going on, I think for them it's going to manifest itself as trauma, because all they're hearing for the last year is that the world is very unsafe. So I think we'll definitely in a couple years be able to look at children who were growing up during the pandemic and see the long-term effects of PTSD. There's a therapist who is already looking at children and how they're perceiving trauma during COVID already, and she said that 1/3 of children experiencing this event are already perceiving it as trauma. So I can only imagine what the studies are going to say in a few years once everybody has a moment to actually process and understand what's happening. When the children get older, kind of how it'll present itself in their everyday life. Trauma can also cause long-term effects, some of this being a decrease in physical health, increase in the risk of committing suicide or self-harm, and a greater risk of substance use, which we can already see and trauma victims in the US. Veterans and people who served in the military are known to usually have a higher chance at abusing alcohol, just because it's a coping mechanism for what they had gone through when they were overseas. So I'm trying to make the argument for this video that I think COVID is going to cause some generational trauma for all of us. I think it is not just going to be something that affects the people who are alive on this planet right now, but for my kids, my grandkids, I think it's going to carry on some quirks and some problems and maybe some different views of the world. And there's already some studies done on generational trauma, but they're still in like their preliminary stages. And even though the first generational trauma study was done in 1966 on children of Holocaust victims, I think they're still not looking into all types of generational trauma. So we don't have as much research done as there should be to completely understand this. But I think, at least from my point of view, that COVID will cause at least some form of generational trauma. There are numerous ways that you can refer to descendants of trauma, but the four main ones would be either as a victim, a fighter, someone who is numb, and those who made it. And I think the ones that kind of present themselves more strongly would be the first three. So victim, fighter, numb. I think if you victimize yourself in your situation, that's very apparent. If you become numb and you ignore what's going on and you force yourself not to think, that's also pretty apparent. And if you're a fighter, then obviously you're fighting back against the generational trauma you've experienced. And then for those who made it, these are the people who managed to get past their generational trauma and move on to other things, which I think is pretty hard, especially if you're a descendant of a Holocaust victim or something similar, something that's very traumatic and very close to home. I think it is pretty difficult to move past it, and you don't necessarily have to move past it to be okay in life, but you do have to find some sort of coping mechanism to be able to move past it and move on with your life. Most generational trauma studies are done on Holocaust victims and their families, and I think this is because the Holocaust was probably the most extreme and ghastly, horrific event that has happened in recent history, and we're so easily able to see the effects on the descendants today, as well as still being able to hear the stories of those who actually suffered during the Holocaust. And it has been shown that children of Holocaust survivors are extremely protective of their parents and also very combative kind of in the world, because they want to fight to make it a better place for those who have gone through the stuff they have. And there was a study done that wanted to see if the children and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors had some sort of mental or physical representations of the trauma that has gone through their family for generations. And it was shown that 35% of them had general anxiety disorder, 26% had major depressive disorder, and 14% exhibited PTSD. And all of this could be shown that it stemmed back from what their parents or their grandparents had gone through. While there is quite a bit of research done on Holocaust victims and how it's been transgenerational and things like that, there hasn't been as much research on other groups. So for example, I think the second most studied would be on Native Americans and how it felt to have their homeland taken away from them. But I think this is hard to study just because they are currently still having their land taken away from them and not treated very nicely, to put it lightly, by the US government. So I think it's also still a bit hard to measure PTSD when the trauma is ongoing and a daily event for them. The same can be said for African Americans, as most African Americans came to America because their ancestors were sold as slaves to be used for whatever the Europeans wanted and the colonizers wanted in the US. And I think this is also still pretty hard to study, the PTSD effects of this, because racism is still very prevalent in the US and they're still experiencing mass trauma such as police brutality and racist events happening in school, in their daily life, all that stuff. So I think it's a bit hard to study this stuff. And the same can also be said for Holocaust survivors, because there is still a lot of anti-Semitism happening in today's world. So I think measuring trauma is a bit hard when all these groups, all these minority groups, are still being traumatized and treated unfairly. So I think that's also why there's a bit of a research gap when it comes to generational trauma. As there is a research gap, it is a bit hard to figure out exactly why generational trauma can occur, but there are a few different reasons. It could be passed on from the parents just by the stories they tell, how they perceive events, the way they parent their children and give them their outlook on life. maybe sociological reasons, the way they're treated by others, or the way their community talks about it, especially if they live in a community of people who have a similar background to them, and also how it's taught in schools. For Native Americans who go to like public schools and not schools on reservations, oftentimes I think their trauma is downplayed in history classes because people, like white Americans especially, don't want to have to feel guilty about what had happened to the Native Americans, so they downplay it in history classes. And for a Native American who's been traumatized and currently still being traumatized, having to listen to teachers basically downplay what they went through and what their ancestors went through, I don't think that helps very much at all. And then another reason could be epigenetics, which is basically like your genetic coding that gets passed down from like your ancestors and your parents and your grandparents. Has like the option to turn on and off, and this is a super complex subject, so I won't go into detail about it. But again, for this, there's not that much research done, so I think probably in about 50 years we're going to have a lot more information and a clearer idea about generational trauma. But the reason why I think that COVID is kind of causing generational trauma is because we're all experiencing it collectively. There's not a single person on this earth who, if you went up to them and started talking about the coronavirus, wouldn't know what you're talking about. So I think since the entire world is experiencing this together, whether they've had COVID, a friend has had COVID, whatever, I think we're going to pass this on to our children. I know when I have kids, I'm going to be annoying. They're going to be like, Mom, I'm sick. I'll be like, I lived through the coronavirus. You can go to school, go. And I think we're just going to pass this kind of stuff on to our children and our grandchildren. So it is something that I think they'll still have the lasting effect on. So I think we'll definitely see people be a lot more careful when they're sick, when going outside. They're hopefully going to be a bit more respectful of others. And if they're feeling sick, they'll put on a mask. But considering how many people don't want to wear masks in the United States, we'll see if that happens. But I just feel like the way we view things and the way we handle things in the future is definitely going to change as a result from this collective trauma we're all experiencing. So this video so far has come across, I think, a little bit negative, talking about trauma and how it's going to translate onto further generations and things like that. So how do we fix this? How can we help ourselves and make sure that we're not too traumatized and we don't pass on our trauma to others? And there are currently a few things available. In some places, they're offering free counseling to healthcare workers. And also, if you look hard enough, I'm sure you could find free counseling in a clinic or something near you if you feel the need to discuss this stuff. And there's some support groups out already for those who have COVID or have had COVID. And like I've said before in the video, this is collective trauma, not just PTSD, since everybody in the world is experiencing it right now. So you can't treat it as you would treat PTSD. And I think we need to give psychotherapists and psychologists, a little bit to figure out exactly the right way to handle this type of stuff, since we haven't ever experienced this type of thing in our lifetimes. And also, it's completely okay to turn off the news and to not pay attention to it for a little bit if that's what you need. I think this is especially beneficial for children. So if you have like a 5 or 6 year old, maybe don't let them see every single thing that the news is playing or what the radio is saying. Give them a break. Let them just be kids and not have to worry for a moment. Of course, stay safe. Don't go to parties. Wear your mask when you're outside. Wear hand sanitizer. Be safe. But it's okay to turn off the news and not pay attention to what's going on in the world for a little bit, just if it helps your mentality. And also, don't downplay the pandemic. I think we're all becoming desensitized to it, and we're not taking it as seriously or as scary as we did at the start, because there are thousands of people dying every day, but people don't seem to care as much anymore. And I think this is partially a coping mechanism because it's so stressful and they don't want to deal with the trauma that they decide to ignore it instead. And I think in order to truly deal with the trauma and get past it, you need to acknowledge what's actually going on around you, take it seriously, and then move on it from there. Don't ignore it, don't desensitize it, take it seriously. Wear your mask. All right, thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions about the stuff I talked about today or just in general, feel free to comment down below or message me on Instagram at PsychE-Learning. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you do, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next week.